The sun was still rising when the sound of hooves echoed down the Red Canyon Trail. Not many rode that way anymore. The land had its ghosts, and most folks in Dry Creek knew better than to stir them. The hills whispered of old blood and older truths, the kind written not in books, but in bones buried beneath cottonwood trees. But this rider wasn't afraid. His name was Tomas Red Elk, though folks in town had learned to call him Tom Redley, a name easier on white tongues, safer for a Lakota child raised at the edges of two worlds. He had left this place 10 years ago, after the fire that took his brother and the lie that buried the truth. He had gone east, fought wars that weren't his, and tried to forget who he was. But now the land had called him back, not for revenge, for justice, and for her. In the middle of town, the Rosewind Saloon was just waking up, the doors still swinging from a rough night of gambling and gin. A few hungover ranch hands stumbled down the boardwalk, tipping hats and avoiding eye contact. From the edge of her window above the general store, Clara Finch spotted the rider before most others. She squinted. Tall in the saddle, coat dusty red, hair pulled back in a low tie, broad shoulders that hadn't bent with time. Her breath caught. She whispered the name she hadn't spoken in years. Tomas! They had been friends once, more than that in another life, before the town turned on him, before the sheriff looked the other way, and before her father demanded she forget. But she never really had. Now he was back, and that could only mean one thing. The truth was finally coming home. Tomas tied his horse outside the old blacksmith's shop, now boarded up, and walked into the general store with quiet confidence. Heads turned, conversation stalled. People didn't recognize him at first, but they knew that coat. Red clay-stained buckskin, the color of the canyon, the color of warning. And the trail he'd ridden down? They used to call it the Red Trail, back when Lakota riders passed through under moonlight and silence. But that was long ago. He stepped to the counter and met the eyes of Emmett Dorsey, the storekeeper who once refused to sell him boots for someone else's kind. "Mornin'," Thomas said. Dorsey cleared his throat. You Redley's boy?" Thomas didn't smile, didn't blink. "I'm the one who remembers." He dropped a small silver coin on the counter and took a tin of coffee. Then he turned and walked out without another word. As he left, Clara stood frozen behind the store shelves, unseen, but her hands trembled, because the boy she once kissed behind the church pews had returned as a man shaped by fire, and carrying truth like a blade. That evening, Clara Finch stayed late in the back room of the general store, going over accounts that didn't quite balance, not because she couldn't do the math, but because her mind wouldn't stay still. The coffee tin was still on the counter. So was the silver coin. She hadn't spoken to Tomas Red Elk, Tom Redley. Not really, not since they were 18. But she remembered everything. The way he rode with quiet confidence, the way he listened before he spoke, and the way he looked at her like she was more than just the banker's daughter. That was before her father made her choose, before the fire, before the lie that took Tomas away. She pressed her palm to her chest as if she could settle the ache behind her collarbone. Then the bell above the door jingled. Clara froze. Footsteps. She stepped out into the store and saw him there, leaning lightly against the doorframe, hat in hand, framed in gold light and dust. "You still write numbers tighter than anyone in Dry Creek," Tomas said. Her lips parted. "And you still walk in like the world owes you no answers." He stepped forward. "Maybe I came for one anyway." She met his eyes. 10 years had carved him sharper, in jaw, in spirit. But there was softness beneath the stoicism. He still wore grief like armor, but something told her he hadn't come to punish the past. He had come to unbury it. "Why now?" she asked quietly. Tomas looked past her, toward the shelves, the walls, the floorboards that hadn't changed since their childhood. "Because the sheriff who buried my brother's death behind accidental fire just got promoted to mayor." Clara inhaled sharply. She had heard. So had everyone. And no one had spoken a word about the family the town had lost in that fire. No one but Tomas. "You think there's proof?" "I think there's truth, and sometimes that's heavier." She hesitated. Then, "What do you need from me?" Thomas looked at her, steady. "Just to remember what we both saw, and maybe to not look away this time." A silence fell between them, not awkward, but heavy with everything left unsaid. Then she nodded, slow, certain. "All right, I'll help." He stepped back, the corner of his mouth tugging into something close to a smile. "I hoped you'd say that." That night, as Clara lit the last lantern and closed the store, she sat at her desk and opened an old box she hadn't dared touch in years. Inside, a ribbon, a pressed wildflower, and a letter Tomas had written the day before he left, unread, unopened, until now. Her fingers shook as she unfolded it. "Clara, if I walk away now, it's not because I don't care. It's because no one in this town will ever believe a Lakota boy can protect what he loves. But one day, I will come back, not to make you choose, just to see if the truth is still waiting to be heard. T." She pressed her hand to her lips, because she hadn't waited. but she hadn't forgotten either. And now she would finally listen, not just with her ears, but with her heart. 2 mornings later, Tomas stood alone at the edge of the old mill road. The same trail that once ran behind the Calloway property, now overgrown with weeds and silence. This was where his brother, Little Hawk, had last been seen. And this was where the fire started. The townsfolk had accepted the story too easily. A lightning strike, a barn fire, a boy who never made it out. No body had ever been buried, just ashes, and one name quickly forgotten. But Tomas had never believed it, because he had seen the boot prints, because he had heard the voice that night, a shout, a struggle, and something else. A gunshot buried beneath thunder. And now, standing in the same dirt 10 years later, he saw something the others never did. The trail hadn't ended. It had been covered. He knelt, brushing aside dried grass and brittle gravel. Faint, but still there. An old depression in the soil, as if something heavy had been dragged. He followed it with his eyes, westward, toward the cliffs that overlooked the canyon. That wasn't where a fire victim would have fled. That was where a secret was meant to disappear. Back in town, Clara scanned ledgers from the year of the fire, her father's personal accounts, which she now managed alone. Her hands hesitated over one entry, ink faded but legible. Sheriff Danner, delivery payment, undisclosed services, $75, cash, July 3rd. The fire happened July 4th. She stared at the line, breath short. Danner. The same man who signed Tomas's report. The same man who told the town not to ask questions. Clara snapped the book shut, heart pounding. She didn't have all the proof yet, but she had a direction, and she wasn't going to pretend she didn't see it. Not this time. That evening, Clara found Tomas sitting behind the church, where the cottonwoods swayed in silence. He was whittling a piece of driftwood, slow, steady, like his mind was miles away. She handed him the ledger page. He read it without speaking. Then he looked up. You always did know where to look. She sat beside him. Do you think it was just Danner? He shook his head. I think Danner was paid, but he wasn't the only one who had something to lose if the truth came out. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Clara asked, voice low, Do you hate them, Tomas? The town? He paused, then replied quietly, I used to, but now I just want to know if this place still remembers how to be honest. Clara's voice barely rose above the wind. Some of us do. He looked at her, and for the first time in 10 years, she wasn't the girl torn between love and loyalty. She was a woman choosing both. The next morning, Tomas rode west. He followed the old trail from the mill road, beyond where it had once been cleared. There were no fresh tracks, just time-worn soil, broken stones, and silence. But the land remembered. He found what he hadn't dared to hope for, the remnants of a campfire, long buried under brush, and nearby a rusted buckle with the letters LH scratched into the back. Little Hawk? It wasn't much, but it was something real, something the fire hadn't erased. He held it in his hand like a heartbeat. Back in town, Clara gathered her courage and stepped through the doors of Dry Creek's small church. Inside, Pastor Emmett Wells was stacking hymnals. He was a kind man, mostly quiet, one of the few who hadn't treated Tomas differently as a boy. Clara walked down the aisle and set the ledger book on the first pew. You were here the night of the fire, she said. Pastor Wells looked up, frowning. So were most folks. She stepped closer. But you were called away that night. I remember. You left supper at our table. You said something about being asked to pray at the Calloway place. His expression tightened. That was a long time ago, Clara. But you remember. The pastor sighed. Yes. He sat down, voice low. It wasn't a fire caused by lightning. It was set. I saw men riding away. One of them had a deputy's badge. I tried to speak later, but the sheriff shut it down. Said it would only stir up division. Clara's breath caught. Why didn't you say anything? His eyes filled with sorrow. Because I was a coward, and because the town chose silence over shame. She closed the ledger gently. It's not too late to choose truth. That evening, Tomas returned. He handed Clara the buckle. She turned it over in her palm, and her eyes welled with tears. They tried to bury him in silence. Tomas nodded. But silence doesn't mean forgotten. Then he held out something else, a small leather bag filled with soil and ash from the site. I'm giving him a name again, a grave, a place the wind can't erase. Clara looked at him, at the man who had come back not for vengeance, but for memory. Do you want me there when you bury it? Tomas hesitated. Would that be proper? Clara stepped closer. It would be right. That night, under a sky filled with stars that hadn't changed since the fire, they dug a small hole beneath the cottonwood trees and placed the buckle and ashes inside. Tomas knelt, Clara beside him. No words, just wind. And then Tomas whispered in Lakota, not loud, not for anyone but his brother. Clara didn't understand the words, but she felt their weight. And when they stood together, something between them had shifted. Not just grief, not just trust, but the beginning of something stronger. News travels slow in the West, but rumors move fast. By the week's end, the town of Dry Creek buzzed with uneasy whispers. Folks had seen Tomas Red Elk riding alone toward the canyon trail. They saw Clara Finch walking beside him through town, ledger in hand, face set like a woman who had made a decision and meant to keep it. And then came the questions. Why had Sheriff Danner's name been in the ledgers? Why did Pastor Wells suddenly stop preaching and start writing letters? Why was the banker's daughter siding with the boy the town once exiled? On Friday morning, Tomas rode into town again, this time with intent. He tied his horse outside the mayor's office, the same office that used to belong to the sheriff. Inside, Mayor Danner looked up from his desk and frowned. "Redley," he said, voice too smooth. "Didn't think you'd come back in through the front door." Tomas stepped in and closed the door behind him. "It's Red Elk now," he said evenly. "And I'm not here to ask." Danner smirked. "What is it you think you know?" Tomas placed the buckle on the desk, then the signed entry from the ledger. Then, finally, a folded statement from Pastor Wells in writing and witnessed. Danner's smile faded. "You can't prove anything with that." Tomas met his eyes. "Maybe not in court, but the people of this town remember, and they're finally ready to listen." Danner stood slowly, jaw tight. "You don't know what you're stirring up, boy." Tomas didn't flinch. "You burned a child's life for your own gain. You buried it in silence. You made my mother grieve twice. You don't get to call me boy anymore." He turned and walked out, and left the door open behind him. That night, Clara hosted a gathering at the church. No preachers, no banners, just chairs, warm coffee, and space to speak. People came, more than expected. And when Tomas stood to tell the story, of Little Hawk, of the fire, of what had been erased, no one interrupted. Clara stood beside him. When he finished, the room was silent. Then Helen Calloway, widow of the very man whose land once bordered the burned field, stood. "I always thought it didn't feel like lightning." She looked at the crowd. "I knew what the sheriff was. I just didn't have the spine to say it back then. But I'm saying it now." Others followed. Whispers became voices. Voices became truth. And by the end of that night, Tomas Red Elk wasn't a stranger anymore. He was the man who reminded Dry Creek what it meant to look itself in the mirror. Later, as the hall emptied, Clara walked with him into the quiet. They stood under the moonlight near the cottonwoods. "You did it," she said. He shook his head. "We did." She smiled. "What happens now?" Tomas looked out over the town. "I don't know, but I'm not riding away tomorrow." He looked back at her, steady. "Unless you want me to." Clara stepped closer. "No, Tomas, not this time." And when she placed her hand in his, there were no fireworks, no sweeping music, just warmth. Steady, rooted, earned, because in the shadow of betrayal they had found honor. In the aftermath of fire, they had found truth. And in each other, they had found home. A week after the town meeting, the world didn't change overnight. But people started looking one another in the eye again. Former Sheriff Danner, resigned without ceremony. The town council voted to reopen old records. And for the first time in a decade, someone added Little Hawk's name to the town's cemetery ledger, a line that should have never gone missing. Tomas didn't ask for praise. He didn't want it. But when a mother placed a single white flower at the cottonwood grove and whispered her son's name beside it, he bowed his head in silence, and something inside him settled. Clara was rebuilding too. The store had been her father's legacy, but she was reshaping it now, clearing out back shelves, opening up space for the Lakota-made goods Tomas had helped her source from traders nearby. "Folk will talk," one neighbor warned, seeing the dream catchers and beadwork hanging by the window. Clara smiled. Let them, because for the first time she wasn't just surviving in Dry Creek. She was changing it. And the person helping her do that wasn't standing behind her. He was standing beside her. One morning, as the frost still clung to the porch railings, Tomas came to the store early. He didn't bring coffee, or tools, or news. He brought a seed pouch. Clara blinked. "What's that?" Tomas grinned. "Rare, soft. Wild corn. My grandfather carried it. Never planted here. Said it needed the right kind of soil." He looked around her land, then met her eyes. "I think this is finally it." Clara took the pouch gently. "You think this town will know what to do with something new growing?" Tomas stepped closer. "Don't care what the town knows." He touched her hand, held it. "I care if we do." There wasn't a kiss, not yet, but there was a silence so warm it could melt years of winter. A silence that said, let's stay, let's try, let's plant something real. That night, Clara wrote a letter to herself, a habit she had when she couldn't sleep. Dear Clara, you waited 10 years to find out if the boy you loved still existed. Turns out he didn't. He came back as a man, not just to finish a story, but to begin one with you. Maybe it's not a dream anymore. Maybe it's something worth planting. Yours finally? Spring came late that year. The soil stayed dry longer than usual, and the air was sharp, even in the sun. But Tomas and Clara planted anyway, with calloused hands, hopeful eyes, and a quiet sort of courage neither of them needed to explain. They planted wild corn near the edge of the store, where the light hit first in the morning. And though it was just a small patch, it felt like a promise. You know, Clara said one afternoon as she wiped her brow with her sleeve. "This is the first thing I've planted that didn't come out of fear." Tomas looked at her, brushing dirt from his palm. "It's the first thing I've planted that wasn't meant to be buried." And she understood exactly what he meant. That night, as they closed the shop, rain finally came. Not a storm, a steady, quiet fall, like the sky letting go after holding on too long. They stood on the porch and listened to it wash over the wood, over the dust, over the town that had started whispering less and nodding more. Clara leaned against the post, arms folded. "You ever think about leaving again?" Tomas shook his head. "I used to, even after coming back." He looked out over the street where the puddles began to form silver in the lantern light. "But I didn't know what home felt like until it was someone, not somewhere." Clara's heart caught in her throat. He didn't look at her when he said it. He didn't need to, because the truth had settled between them long before the words did. And for the first time, she let herself feel it without guilt. The next morning, Tomas woke early, pulled on his boots, and stepped out to find the first sprouts pushing through the earth. Tiny, green, and stubborn. Clara stood behind him, still barefoot, coffee in hand. "They survived the cold," she said. He nodded. "So did we." Then he turned to her, more serious. "Clara, I came back for the truth. I never expected to find a future." She stepped closer. "That makes two of us." This time there was no hesitation. She reached for him. He met her halfway. The kiss wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. It was honest, grounded, like roots finally given the rain they'd waited years for. And in that moment, the ghosts of the past didn't vanish. They simply bowed their heads and let them live. Summer arrived like a quiet miracle. The corn grew, strong and taller than Clara expected. Each morning she walked barefoot to check the stalks, brushing the leaves gently, like greeting a child. And every evening Tomas walked beside her, the two of them not saying much, because they didn't need to. The town had changed too. Not everyone spoke kindly of the new store signs written in Lakota beneath the English, but no one dared tear them down. Not anymore. Pastor Wells continued to speak out. Helen Calloway started a petition to rename the trail where Little Hawk died. And at the edge of town, under the cottonwood trees, a new marker had been placed, carved by Thomas's own hands. Little Hawk Red Elk brother, son lost but never gone. When Clara saw it for the first time, she cried. "You gave him more than a grave," she whispered. "You gave him back his name." Tomas nodded, his voice low. "No one should have to fight this hard to exist." Then he added softly, "I don't want you to ever feel like you have to either." One afternoon, Tomas rode to the Lakota camp beyond the ridge, a place he hadn't visited since he was a boy. The people there had known his father, remembered his mother, and welcomed him now not as a stranger, but as someone who had come full circle. He brought Clara with him. At first she was nervous. She didn't know the language, didn't know the customs. But the women greeted her with warmth, one elder placing a beaded necklace over her head and saying something that made Tomas pause. "What did she say?" Clara asked. Tomas smiled. "That you walk with thunder in your chest and roots in your feet, that you're not here to visit, you're here to stay." Clara laughed quietly. "That's the kindest thing anyone's ever said about my boots." But it meant more than that. She knew it, and so did he. That night, back at the ranch house, Clara's old home now shared between them, she sat beside Tomas under the stars. The wind was gentle, the fire crackling. He turned to her. "I've been thinking," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "About what?" He hesitated, then took her hand. "About building something permanent, a life, a home, a family, if you'll have it." Clara blinked once, then smiled, and whispered the only answer that mattered. Yes, they didn't need a ring yet. They didn't need a date. Because between the justice they'd fought for and the land they now tended, they'd already made their vow. The wind that rolled through Dry Creek in August was different, warmer, but softer somehow, as if even the land had started to breathe easier. Tomas spent more days working with his hands now, clearing out an old shed near the store, shaping it into something new, a workshop where he could carve and teach, just like his grandfather once did. Beads, tools, instruments, objects that carried story, not just function. Clara helped organize shelves and set up a corner for books, ledgers at first, then donated novels, then even a few children's readers from a neighboring school. "You think someone will actually come learn from us?" she asked one afternoon, brushing dust off a window. Thomas smiled. "They already have, even if they don't know it yet." Because the two of them standing side by side, Lakota man and settler woman, not hiding, not apologizing, was a lesson in itself. One the town had begun to absorb. Even the mayoral office had gone quiet. No more accidental letters about tax reevaluation. No more muttered warnings from townsfolk about how things used to be. And when a young Lakota boy named Chayton started stopping by to ask Tomas questions about how to carve arrowheads, Clara saw something that made her eyes well up. A child free to be proud of where he came from. That night, Tomas brought out a box he had been hiding beneath the floorboards. Clara raised an eyebrow. "Are you smuggling secrets now?" He grinned and opened it. Inside, a ring. Simple, silver. etched with a single red stone in the center, the same red of the canyon trail where he had returned. He didn't kneel, didn't make a speech. He just held it out, his voice steady, his eyes steady. I don't want to marry a future I imagined. She tilted her head. No? He shook his head. I want to marry you, the real you, who fights when no one's looking, who speaks when it's hard, who never let go even when I was gone. Clara swallowed hard. Then she slipped the ring on her finger. Then don't ever leave again. Tomas pulled her close. I wasn't meant to stay away. They didn't kiss just then. Instead, they sat down on the porch step, hands tangled, hearts calm, because not every love is built on fireworks. Some are built like fences, post by post, line by line, truth by truth. And the strongest ones are never rushed. As the moon rose and the hills stretched into shadow, Clara looked out across the land and whispered, So this is what peace feels like. Tomas nodded. Not peace, home. The day of the wedding was simple. Not because it had to be, but because that's how they wanted it. Under the cottonwood trees where Little Hawk's name had been restored, Clara and Tomas stood hand in hand, surrounded not by grandeur, but by people who had chosen to change. The townsfolk came, not all, but enough. Pastor Wells spoke a few words, soft, full of gratitude. Chayton carried the carved ring box with both hands like it was sacred. Clara wore a dress that once belonged to her mother. Tomas wore the red buckskin coat his father left behind. Both of them carried truth on their shoulders, not shame. When they said their vows, there was no trembling in their voices, because their love hadn't been built on fleeting glances or perfect moments. It had been forged through silence, tested by loss, and chosen again and again in fire and in forgiveness. Afterward, the townspeople lingered longer than expected. There were pies, laughter, stories retold with softer edges. Even Helen Calloway hugged Clara like she'd known her all her life. Tomas stood at the edge of the gathering, looking out at the red trail, the same one he'd ridden back down months ago. But now it didn't feel like a return. It felt like an origin. Clara joined him, sliding her hand into his. You think we changed this place? She asked. He shook his head. No, I think we reminded it of what it could be. She smiled. And us? Tomas turned to her, the breeze catching her hair like a page turning in the wind. We're not finished. No. He leaned in. We're just starting to write the part where we stay. Later that night, as stars blanketed the plains, Tomas carried Clara over the threshold of their small cabin. The same one she had grown up in, now filled with new breath, new stories. On the mantel sat the seed pouch, now empty, planted, watered, growing. Because the red trail was never just about riding for justice. It was about finding a place to rest, to love, and to live forward. And in the shadow of the Lakota, beneath truth and wind and old blood made whole, they found a future where love didn't have to fight anymore. It just belonged.